Hello, everyone. Computershare is a global leader in corporate trust, transfer agency, employee equity plans, stakeholder communications, and a range of other diversified financial and governance services. As an industry-leading provider of trustee services in P3 projects across the country, Computershare participates in many of Canada's prominent P3 and project finance transactions in infrastructure projects including healthcare, transportation, utilities, and governance services. On behalf of Computershare, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this session, David McFadden, Counsel at Gowling. David has an incredible range of experience in the energy sector. He is the chair of the board of directors of Toronto Hydro, a board member of the Ontario Energy Association, and vice chair of the Energy Transformation Network of the Independent Electricity System Operator of Ontario. He is also a member of CCPPP's Board of Directors and chair of the Council's Communications and Government Relations Committee. Please join me in welcoming David and the panel.
Well, good morning, everybody. I was afraid we would have been into the afternoon by the time we started here. Unfortunately, the conference is running about a half hour late, and I gather lunch has been delayed a bit, so don't worry, you're not going to miss your lunch. The title of our session this morning is Disrupting the Energy Sector. Now, that has a pretty ominous ring to it, disruption. We could have entitled it Innovations which will transform the energy sector, and that would have been a lot more benign, but disruption seems to be the word of the day in terms of our life in North America. If you look at what's happened in the United States, Europe, Brexit, populism rising around the world. So we thought, well, let's use the word disruption, since it seems to be the word of at least 2018. Now, we have 5 distinguished speakers who bring to our panel a wonderful cross-section of experience, a wealth of expertise in the various areas of the energy sector. Now, we're going to begin our session this morning with what we're calling scene-setting remarks, which will be given by Ron Dizy. Now, he'll outline the technological and other developments happening in the energy sector, which promise to disrupt or transform the sector and change the risk profile of future investments in the energy industry. Now, following Ron's remarks, I will address questions to each member of the panel to get their view on this topic from their respective experiences and activity. And after that, we will go to questions from the audience. So at the outset, I'd like to introduce each of the members of the panel at the start, and then we'll just go questions. As I mentioned, our first speaker is Ron Dizy. Ron is the managing director of the Advanced Energy Center at Mars, as well as serving as senior vice president partnership of Mars. Now, in case you think he's an extraterrestrial, or an astronaut who arrived here, I should point out that Mars is one of the world's largest urban innovation hubs. Based here in Toronto, Mars works with over 1,000 companies across multiple sectors, helping them scale up their businesses. And one of those sectors is the energy sector. Mars works with both public and private partners to accelerate the adoption of innovative energy technologies, and Ron coordinates those investments. Following Ron, I'll be asking questions of Andrew Clark. He is the founder and co-CEO of Spark Power. Spark Power provides a variety of services and equipment with a focus on renewable and sustainable energy. In 2017, Andrew was nominated as the O&Y Entrepreneur of the Year. Sitting next to Andrew is Brian Bentz. Brian is the president and CEO of Alectra, the largest municipally owned utility by customer base in Canada. The distribution network of Alectra serves almost 1 million customers. Now, beyond his work at Alectra, Brian plays a key leadership role in the energy industry. He is currently the chair of the Electrical Safety Authority. He's also chair of the Stakeholder Advisory Committee of the Independent Electricity System Operator. He's a member of the board of directors of the Ontario Energy Association, having served previously as the chair of that organization. Sitting next to Brian is Olivia Steedman. She's the managing director in the Infrastructure Natural Resources Group of Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. Teachers' Infrastructure and Natural Resources Group manages some $25 billion in a global portfolio of equity investments in both greenfield and brownfield infrastructure assets and natural resources businesses. And our final speaker is Ram Mahidhara. He is the Chief Investment Officer for Infrastructure and Natural Resources at the International Finance Corporation in Washington, D.C. Ram brings to our panel some 25 years of experience in the emerging markets. At IFC, Ram has worked on both origination and asset management in transportation, logistics, telecom, mining, and power in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. So that's the panel. So I'd now like to call upon Ron Dizy to give us a scene setter, please.
All right. Thanks. So yeah, I usually start these by saying, my name is Ron and I'm from Mars.
Yeah.
I usually get something. David gave you the background. Mars, actually North America's largest urban innovation hub, one of the largest in the world. Our purpose is helping innovators change the world. For me, that means that innovation has to be cost effective and has to be financeable, and that's why I'm really delighted to be here. Otherwise, it doesn't scale, right? We can do pilot projects and we can get governments or different kinds of companies to pay, but if we actually want to change the world, we have to do these things at scale. And the only way you do that is if they are ultimately cost effective and can be funded. David asked me to kind of give you 4 main themes that we see that I think dramatically affect and will actually help cause the disruption that we're talking about. So the first is customer expectations are changing, and they're changing everywhere. If you think about your experience with things like Spotify as a music service or Netflix, they're dramatically different, right? They're just way better from what they used to be. Or something like Amazon, where we've actually changed the expectation from ordering something and now we actually expect to kind of get it today. Those expectations will eventually make their way to the energy sector, and in general, I think we see utilities, the conventional ways of receiving these things, these services, are still kind of caught up in a fairly old way of doing things. And the opportunity is for that to change. The opportunity is for utilities to do that, but if they won't, I'm pretty convinced that somebody else will be there to do it. So that might mean thinking about mixing energy with adjacent offerings. That might be making more holistic offerings to the customer. It will be different than it is now, and it will be at a scale and with benefits that the customer maybe doesn't even perceive today, but new entrants will bring those opportunities. New partnerships will bring those opportunities to markets. And I think in general, the average customer is going to not feel beholden by whatever regulatory constraints we think are there, right? This idea of monopolies, et cetera. I think the average customer will say, if I can get it a different way that's better, I will. And that will also drive change faster. The second big change, I think, are that demand and the way we generate for that demand are changing. So it used to be that we kind of knew that demand would grow at, 2, 3, 4, 5%. I mean, but we might be a little bit wrong. We kind of knew it would grow. All of a sudden, if you take a look at Ontario, the ISO, who is responsible for making these forecasts, has sort of said, we don't know. They've actually got 4 different demand forecasts now, depending on a bunch of different assumptions. So that arises from 2 things. One is, what will the rate of electrification be? Are we going to have things like EVs happen at scale? Are we going to partially electrify heat, for example? These are big movers in terms of demand on the grid. But the second question is, what will be supplied by the grid and what will be supplied maybe in different ways, right? Privately. So this idea of central generation over transmission over distribution is even being called into question. So as we have alternatives in markets, right, as these alternatives are solar and usually more decentralized, and I think the drivers of this will be not just are they cheaper, do they give better control to the customer, going back to point one, but it's also they're just easier to site, right? Big projects tend to be hard to site, hard to get approvals for, and we might still try to do that, but at the end of the day, these smaller ones that are just easier to get approved just happen a lot faster. That's number two. The third one is climate change. So climate change clearly causes a disruption. It may cause disruption to the infrastructure, but I think what we want to watch for is elements of climate change, when they happen, tend to drive behavioral changes. Toronto had a very serious bad ice storm, 2013. And all kinds of people said, I never want that to happen again, and they bought backup generators. I mean, that created a sense of some additional infrastructure in the system that eventually could be used for other purposes. So I think what's interesting about that is they did it, in many cases, these are not economic on conventional ways of viewing things. But when people feel like they're losing control, when they feel like they've lost control about, they've lost the expectation the grid could supply energy to them, they make different decisions. Those different decisions, again, change what will be served by the grid and changes the overall system that the grid operates in. And then finally, we are seeing, and kind of overlaying all these things, we're seeing changes in business models, new business models being brought to the market. I'll give you two examples. One is a company called Sonnenbatterie, a German company that partnered with Mandalay Homes and the Arizona Public Service. It operates the grid in Arizona. And they added storage and some solar to houses in a new community. And because of the way they did that, the APS, Arizona Public Service, had lower costs of infrastructure to serve that community. So you had this interesting business model where part of the grid savings could be attributed to these batteries, and there was actually a partnership around thinking about how to provide the infrastructure for a new community. The second one I'll give you is that many of you may have heard of is Tesla's efforts in South Australia. I'm not going to talk about the big battery, but about the more recent announcement of 50,000 homes, 5 kilowatt solar panels, plus a Tesla Powerwall 2. And the idea of this now, no cost to the homeowner, so a piece of private-public partnership between Tesla and the government, interestingly the government, not the utility, to supply what amounts to a very large, decentralized grid asset, right? Energy plus storage in the grid. And I think so. I think the evidence would be we're already seeing examples of this. They're maybe not called the same things, but we're seeing examples of this already. Thank you, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ron. So that sets the table a bit. And as you can tell, that it creates some interesting issues for opportunities, number one, but also issues for players who are now in the sector and invested in the sector. So maybe I'll start off with you, Andrew. Spark Power is one of those companies that's on the innovation end. I mean, you're looking to bring innovative energy solutions, which fits the scenario that Ron's talked about. Question I've got for you, is the customer actually asking for alternatives to the grid? I mean, is this an idea that nobody's asking for, but you're providing it to them? And taking that into account, do you believe there's a realistic alternative to the current electricity grid itself? Even if the customer wants it, is there a realistic alternative?
Sure. So, good question. I don't think we're a solution in search of a problem as far as we've seen in the market. Spark Power, we have about 6,500 customers across Canada and the US, and we provide them electrical services. So that can be low voltage electrical services, high voltage, we can do renewable services. And so what we've established with our customers is a position of trusted advisor. And they're coming to us really with four things that they're looking for from the grid: resiliency, reliability, sustainability, and cost reduction. So of those four aspects, to the extent that the grid is not supplying one of those four, not meeting their needs in one of those four categories, they're asking for alternatives. With regard to sustainability, Ontario's made great strides in cleaning up its grid, decarbonizing its grid. There's, large organizations now have carbon targets, and so we're finding our customers are looking for renewable energy. There are other grids that aren't as clean, Alberta being one as an example. And until such time as those grids become 100% renewables, then our customers are going to continue to search for a resolution. One of our subsidiaries, Bullfrog, that's what they do. They provide renewable energy credits, and they green our customers' power. There's a long way to go in Canada. We have 35 megawatts of coal generation in Canada, and that's going to take $10 billion or so to replace over time. So there's a long way to go with regards to making the grid cleaner. As far as reliability and resiliency, it can wreak havoc on some manufacturers' facilities. I know that that Hydro One measures their outages in 2-minute increments, and anything underneath 2 minutes, they just don't count. It just didn't happen. Well, it certainly has happened for our customers, because you'll see situations where they're out for 30 seconds and they have to reboot their whole facility. So reliability can cost them a lot of money, as well as resiliency. If the grid goes down, they want to know that they can keep running. As far as cost is concerned, it's the largest driver, specifically for our customers. They've seen prices increase, every year, and it keeps rising in their P&L, and they need some line of sight as to how they're going to manage those costs. If you talk about distributed energy resources, and you're talking about corporate PPAs or a behind-the-meter battery, these are things that they can do to stabilize their cost and have line of sight into the future.
Now, the audience here today is not a group of energy experts, I would bet. I know there's some, because I see some people like Michael in the front row and Andrew Lynn in the back and so on. But a lot of people here aren't. For an investor, what kind of investment amounts are you talking about? I mean, obviously there's grid level, there's set nuclear plants, massive spending. What kind of investment opportunity is there, though, for somebody who's just sitting here today saying, well, I got a fund, what do I want to invest in?
There's massive, it's huge. I think the Electrical Research Institute in the United States has estimated that's going to be $476 billion to transform the grid to a smart grid. And that doesn't include any of the DERs, the distributed energy resources. In Canada, that's probably, you take the Canadian exchange rate, it's probably $60 billion just in Canada alone, just to upgrade the grid to make it intelligent so it can deal with two-way flow of information, two-way flow of energy. So there's a huge amount of investment that's going to be made into the grid and into distributed energy resources over the next, I would say, 10 to 20 years.
Now, I wonder if I could turn to you, Brian, because you represent the largest municipally owned utility in Canada, and the largest in Ontario, in this particular area of Canada. We've heard a lot about how this could disrupt the life of grid players, the owners and the operators of grid. Now, I know that Alectra has been an innovative company. You've looked at a lot of interesting ideas. I mean, some utilities have fought that. You haven't. So I wonder if you'd perhaps give us some idea of what's your reaction to Andrew's point? Where do you see utilities going in this era of technological disruption?
We are at the cusp of dramatic change in the sector. We looked at a curve information that we looked at in terms of adoption of new technologies that was put out by the World Economic Forum. And they looked at this S-curve when you get to 80% adoption rates in the 20s and 30s on electrification and cars, and then in the 40s in appliances, white label appliances, the 60s, color TVs, VCRs, and more recently, mobile devices and internet-based technologies. And the curve is getting steeper and steeper. So the adoption rates are faster and faster. You look at what happened with you talk about Uber or Airbnb, using that digitized platform to create value is very disruptive. It hasn't happened in the power sector yet, but we're on the verge of it happening. And they forecast that edge of grid technologies, that disruption, digitized disruption, will happen in the next 5 to 10, begin to happen, and then it's already happened now. But the steepness of that curve will happen in the next 5 to 10 years. So we look at what happened, and Ron talked about the IESO, and what has been the experience of the grid in Ontario. So in Ontario, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, total consumption in the province was around 155 terawatt hours. Today, it's about 130 terawatt hours, and that's virtually all been displaced by conservation and embedded generation. And so that's 25 terawatt hours that's basically come right off the grid. And the forecast, notwithstanding the fact there's so much, and I agree, so much uncertainty, is that by 2030, that number could be 50 to 70 terawatt, so half could be there. So when you're an incumbent operator whose role is to take centralized generation and deliver it to the meter base, and it's doing this, and your costs are doing that, and yet these off-grid solutions, so battery storage, $1,000 a kilowatt hour 10 years ago, now under 300, going to 70, according to Bloomberg. EVs, the range has tripled. The cost of the battery has gone down by a third. So, and then we're seeing similar things in solar, but it's not just the devices, it's the interconnectivity of the devices. So when you put those elements together and you put intelligence with them together, so this is where Andrew's talking about this DERMS platform, Distributed Energy Resource Management software. Now all of a sudden I've got something that can optimize behind the meter, but also aggregate in the community and inject back into the grid. So it becomes intelligent. It can respond to price signals. It can respond to consumption patterns. So now you're building a neural network. So whereas before you had this passive grid that was just using bulk capacity to deliver energy, now you're looking at a grid that's interactive and fluid and almost like an internet of energy. So this is our challenge, is to move from here to there. And in my view, it's going to happen. So we're doing that. And how do you do that? You have to digitize the customer relationship first off. So you have to create a new customer experience that is more digitized, more proactive, omni-channel. You got the customer, you're giving information proactively to customers in real time. So energy savings tips, outage restoration, bill monitoring, all of these things. Be very proactive and do that. You've got to build intelligence into the grid. So we talk about self-healing networks and the ability, like sub-second response, like Andrew says, because customers, automotive customers, or specialized industrial loads and injection molding or other types of applications, they can't take a 3-cycle outage, which is an auto reclose on a system. It'll shut down production. So we need sub-second, sub-cycle almost response to do that. You need a intelligently wired system to be able to make that happen. So build intelligence into the grid, and then work with partners. So there's partners here in terms of partners who can innovate, because we can't do it all as utilities. We have the customer relationship, we have the incumbent position, but we got lots of iron, steel in the air and copper in the ground too. That's good because it gives you a revenue model, but it's bad because you try and hang on to those legacy revenue streams. So what you've got to do is partner with innovators, build those new energy solutions together, integrate them with the grid, build intelligence, and invest in that next generation grid. And I agree with Andrew, this is a multi hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. Our balance sheet is about $4.5 billion. We spend $300-400 million a year on capital. Most of that now is in the traditional utility. I think we're going to turn that on its head and probably double the investment over the course of the next 10 years, and as we move to this new neural network.
That leads to a question, if I could ask a follow-on just from that. Are you suggesting this could all be done on the regulated utility, or are you suggesting this comes outside of the regulated utility into sort of unregulated affiliates? I mean, how does all this happen?
The answer is yes.
Yes, okay, that's good.
Yeah. No, I mean, but seriously, regulators around the world are grappling with this issue because you've had a traditional grid where monopoly boundaries were easily defined. Now edge of grid, there's competition out there. It was like, once you get past the meter base, well, that's simple, right? So it's all monopoly delivery up until then. Yeah. But now you've got people like Andrew out there disrupting everything and
screwing everything up.
going to all the customers saying, have I got a deal for you? And he does. And so that changes, there's competition. So it's customer choice at the edge of the grid. Well, how far does that go? And who decides who connects to the grid? And under what conditions do they decide how they connect to the grid? And who does the integrated resource planning for this grid? If you've got congestion points, I can maybe use what he's offering to relieve congestion points on the grid. So Ofgem in the UK is looking at this incentive-based, outcome-based model. So we're moving away from rate-based, rate of return, capital-based models to transactive-based models, transaction-based models, value-based models, and moving away from CapEx to TOTEX. Because I could have a SaaS model for someone, I could offer them software as a service, I could go to cloud computing. To the extent that's all in operations, I don't get a rate of return on that. So we're looking at, regulation is in the midst of disruption itself, and you see it everywhere, like New York REV and California PUC and the Ontario Energy Board. We have the Advisory Committee on Innovation. And so that's something and Andrew's on that too. So we're trying to figure it out. So exciting times.
Now, Olivia, if I can turn to you. Now, you are an investor. Teachers, as I mentioned at the outset, invested $25 billion in related infrastructure assets of various types. Do you see an opportunity in this? And how do you see the opportunity from the point of view of financing? And do you see opportunities in here maybe for public-private partnerships as well, like looking at it from the outside as an investor?
The short answer is yes. I completely agree with my colleagues on the opportunity and, frankly, the size of it. This is absolutely an unprecedented time for investment in electric grids. Whole grids are being rebuilt, as we've already heard today. In terms of public-private partnerships, maybe it's useful to say that there has been decades of private sector participation, including by institutional investors such as ourselves in the electric industry. As an example, we own 50% of the electric distribution business in the south part of Chile. It's a company called Saesa. It also owns some transmission and some generation. And so, all of these phenomena that have been described earlier, we're seeing unfolding through our lens as an owner in utilities. But we're also seeing it as really a chance to get into the new areas that have been described today, including in areas such as EV charging, batteries, and smart meters. The thing that's tough for us with these investments, and again, it's already been discussed a little bit, is that these are not the traditional revenue streams. You're not necessarily going to get a nice long-term contracted PPA with a creditworthy off-taker. You're not necessarily going to have Ofgem wrapping a regulatory construct. And even TOTEX, there's so much devil in the detail there, but we have been working with regimes like that for some time already. These new revenue streams are very different, including because you need to take a view on technology. You need to take a view on software. Our investment in STEM, which is an artificial intelligence powered battery company, puts batteries behind the meter in C&I for C&I customers. Really the magic there is the AI that tells the battery when to dispatch. And so it's a difficult thing to diligence software and machine learning because obviously it's evolving all the time. So for institutional investors such as ourselves, getting over that is something that we're trying to figure out quite quickly. And the other point I'd make that is new is just this relationship with the customer. Certainly, making sure that our customers feel like they're getting quality of service has long been a part of our mantra as investors in these kinds of companies. But the customer now does expect new things, as Ron has described. They do want to almost treat their energy offering as they would any, buying a retail good, et cetera, and they expect it to be nimble and moving all the time. And so again, for someone like us who invests in long-term steady cash flows, for this to all of a sudden be something you can't necessarily build a DCF model around is a bit of a challenge. So I think there's lots of opportunity, and it means that just as my colleagues have been hustling, it means the investors like us need to hustle as well.
Olivia,
Yeah.
Teachers is a worldwide investor. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't just invest in Canada, or certainly not just in Ontario.
Yeah.
In this particular sector, have you seen any areas of the world that are particularly promising? Is it Canada, for example, or is it the United States or somewhere else? Or have you really, is there a clear pattern that you can support in any individual market?
I think this is happening everywhere. Certainly in the developed markets with established grids, it is a little bit more complicated. And I've been learning from some friends at Toronto Hydro, how complicated a grid such as this is, so the one that we're benefiting from at this very moment. And so that does create a new technical challenge, but it doesn't mean the opportunity is less. In newer and emerging markets, and I know Ram is going to speak to this, there is an opportunity there because not all of them are electrified yet. For them to leapfrog where we are and build these new grids really from scratch. And so you're not overcoming a phenomenon where you had a centralized generation and transmission that needs to be upgraded. You really are building the generation close to where it's required. And it means a completely different configuration for the grids that move the electrons around. And so in terms of patterns and themes, I think, we very much think of new world, if you will, like brand new build versus old world, and say, both of them have very meaningful investment opportunities. And the trick there is to have, the right partners, the right platforms. We very much have to invest through platforms at Teachers because we are an institutional investor. But, if you can have people on the ground who understand the markets, who understand the customer preferences, the link-ins, the interfaces, the regulation, that is the way to go.
Ram, if I could turn to you. Now, you come from the international market, to the developing world. There's been a lot of stuff written about the importance of energy information, particularly renewables, in developing countries around the world. What's your experience at IFC on that? Where do you see the opportunities in terms of, for example, this audience, investment opportunities or work with IFC in this area?
Thank you, David. Let me figure out where to start. I mean, I was listening to all of you, and I saw the amount of disruption that's kind of facing us as it comes through. And in my mind, the disruption was turning into opportunity, and for the very reason that a couple of you mentioned, Olivia, you mentioned, and that a large part of the developing markets that we operate in are not yet electrified. So you've got about 1.1 billion people who don't have power yet. Roughly half of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. About a quarter of them, 250 million or so or more, are in India. And you don't have that electrification yet. So you've got, in some ways, virgin territory, right? The other issue that you see in developing markets is that a lot of people live spread out, and therefore you don't have the easy, traditional, let's put a grid line, let's get the money and connect them. Just take Papua New Guinea, for example, right? You've got about 7 billion people in Papua New Guinea. Over 4 billion of those, there are 2 grids in that country, 2 unconnected grids, one going towards the mountains from the capital, one going north a little bit further away. And there are about 4 million people who live more than 30 kilometers away from any grid, right? You're not going to be able, now that's a small number, relatively speaking, for an island economy. But when you start adding that to, when you look at places in sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, you're going to see a tremendous amount of opportunity. So that's one thing. So what we've seen is, we've seen that over the last 10, 20 years, we've seen a tremendous disruption in terms of how power is being fueled in our markets. We've seen a tremendous drop in the cost of solar, for example, rapidly. And it's not just solar, it's wind, it's storage. All of those are coming down, right? So we've seen that happening. At the same time, we've seen an increase in pollution. And therefore, climate change is beginning to create an issue for people. And then what we've seen is fuel costs play an issue. So every country that has coal is not only getting hit politically, but also the cost. Every country that's got oil, and a lot of the ones that don't have resources and are inland tend to do this. So you have all of these issues coming up. And it's the developing countries that I think that have been at the forefront of trying to take advantage of this change. China has roughly half the solar installations of the world today. India has announced 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022. If they get that 175 gigawatts, that's probably going to be 30 to 40% of the total installed capacity by that time. It's an enormous amount of move. So let's put that aside. There's another disruption that's coming, and it's a nice disruption, and that's the movement in more conventional, and that's what I call the FSRUs. Because we believe that the FSRUs have now brought gas-powered plants into the reach of many countries that was hitherto not affordable. And what that does is it is still fossil fuel, but for the next 10, 15 years, while you have storage slowly becoming mainstream, you will have that ability to respond more quickly. So here are some of the things that we are seeing. IFC itself has done about, in the area of generation, distribution, and transmission, we've played a role. We've done about 40 gigawatts of financing in the developing world, of which about 20 gigawatts have been in renewables. We count hydro as renewable. So if you take pure wind and pure solar, we've done something like about 4 and 4 gigawatts each. So that's one area, right? The other thing that I wanted to touch base on is distribution companies. You will have a grid. The grid is, in some ways, the grid is dead, long live the grid. We have these conversations, but we're going to see the grid remain for a long time, right? It's just going to face disruptions. And for us, for the grid to be more reliable, more resilient, we need to have much more investment in that from the transmission side, even in developing countries. We need to have also much better, much more robust distribution companies. And we've invested in about 60 discos. And what we've done so far is to try and get them to, reduce their losses, T&D losses, technical and commercial losses, improve efficiency, reach out to, and increase the reach of people. Each of these makes a difference in terms of actually stabilizing the amount of power that's needed. And then in the transmission area, we've tried to help with some amount, relatively limited, but that's an area that needs investing. And I'll come back to it perhaps in a later context, but there are at least 3 examples where we've done PPP, which I'd like to come back to later.
Okay. Can I ask, well, maybe we'll hit that now because I got a question, the first question shown up. But if I could ask you a question just about public-private. I mean, we've got people in the audience here who could be investors in projects and have not even thought about working with you or anybody else in one of the developing countries that you're. Are there realistic opportunities for Canadian investors, and in what areas would you suggest that might be?
So I would see, the answer is yes. I mean, that's our bread and butter. That's what we do. And that's, Olivia has pointed out, she's kind of led the stage in Chile and other places, but there's a lot of stuff that we do. So you've got to watch out for, so I think utility scale renewables are clearly possible. And what we do is we are going into countries where you have a grid that's reasonably resilient, reasonably reliable, nothing like the US, nothing like Canada, nothing like Western Europe, but it's handleable. And we've seen this happen in Zambia. And the way we are approaching some of these is we're basically saying, let's provide an end-to-end solution. Emerging markets raise such a fear in lots of investors because you have political risk, you have regulation that's not very clear, you have templates that are not very clear in terms of the legal agreements, You have financing that's usually not available when you want it. So we've provided an end-to-end solution and scaling solar is the example I want to use. In Zambia, what we did was we provided actually all of those, a rapid tendering process. We advised the government how to design and set up solar plants. This we did with the World Bank group, with the World Bank. We provided risk mitigation and credit enhancement and financing. And we had 11 qualified bidders. NL, a lot of these folks came in and bid on this. And Zambia got 6 cents a kilowatt hour, which, because it's not indexed, effectively works out to 4 cents a kilowatt hour of solar. Unbelievable and unheard of in those days. Yeah. Today, yes, solar. Great. Now, this is small. It's only 100 megawatts, 2 plants. Now this is spread to Senegal, where we've got 4.7. This then moves on to Ethiopia. It moves on elsewhere. You'll start seeing this pattern come up in many places. The same thing in Egypt. In Egypt, we've managed to, EBRD and IFC both ran parallel programs, and we ended up doing 750 megawatts of solar, 13 projects all bundled together with the World Bank starting and reforming the government sector, helping them to start getting remove subsidies. And then from there on, you move, and we ended up helping them with feed-in tariffs and financing and credit enhancement. MEGA also came in. And you have each of these batches, EBRD and IFC, roughly about 750 megawatts. That's a lot in a country like that. So you start seeing these rapid changes.
It looks to me as if what we have is a world of disruption and opportunity at the same time, which makes it interesting.
Right.
Now, we have a first question, and this is particularly of interest, I know, to people in Ontario, but it does fit other jurisdictions in the world. And the question is, where does generation like nuclear fit into a world with variable demand that can't adapt quickly? So nuclear plants, Duncan Hawthorne, at Bruce Power used to say, what is it? Nuclear powers are elephants. They don't dance well. So in a jurisdiction like Ontario, what do we do when over 60% essentially of the power we use is typically generated by nuclear? How does that fit into this new world? Anybody want to tackle that one? Ron.
So, I mean, there's an argument that when you're designing or planning a system that you want to think about the amount of nuclear you have and the amount of very high baseload. But I'll say that this is easy to solve, and it's storage, right? I mean, all you have to do is add enough storage to the grid that you've got the ability to take from the nuclear during times that you're oversupplying, and then provide it at other times. And I think that will be the question. I mean, the nuclear. I think the question for nuclear is, can it reliably? Nuclear's big problem is that it's not been able at the beginning of a project to be able to say what the cost of energy from that asset will be at the end of the project, right? So it just historically has gone over on costs, and so you're just like, I have no idea what it is. We're told this time will be different, right? If you talk to OPG around the refurbs around Darlington,
Well,
and certainly Bruce would say the same thing. On budget, and so it will be the first time that happens. But I think, look, at a high level, to operate any grid, you need energy, capacity, and then you need flexibility. And this is the thing that we haven't done a great job of valuing yet. So grids are pretty good at valuing capacity and energy, and that's, I know when you're thinking about, the energy that comes from solar, that's great, but you still need the capacity to supply during other times. I think as we properly value flexibility, the right balance of payments will occur in grids, and I think this works. I mean, our grid is quite reliable at 61%, I think, nuclear right now.
Brian, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, from a a delivery agent point of view, it's been expressed by a number of members of the panel. It's not the death spiral of the grid itself. It's a rebalancing of the grid. So it will be an optimization of what was centralized generation with intelligence at the edge of the grid. And you have to sort of unbundle or unpack the sources of generation. If you got high capacity factor, low cost, and now becoming more modular, nuclear, there's a place for that. because all of these solutions we're talking about in the existing grid is really around intermediate and load following. So transactive energy is load following, DER is load following, microgrids are load following, nanogrids are load following. You need that base load generation, that 24/7 block. I'm not sure how we do that, more efficiently. We don't need storage. But there's different sort of price signals in terms of how you stratify generation. And to me, it is the workhorse of the system. It's there now. We're sort of doubling down on it as well. That I think it can and should be part of the. Well, at least in Ontario. I mean, emerging economies might be a different story, but
it's
too
already emerging
expensive.
economies. Egypt, I mean, all kinds.
So I see it as part, at least in Ontario, baseload generation, and then we talk about this evolving of what is the definition of the utility going forward? Is it a distribution system operator? So it acts like a system operator. It dispatches. It does load balancing in real time. Or is it a platform operator where it actually enables the economy and transactive energy? Or is it a load-serving entity where it actually procures power at the edge of the grid? I think it can do all of those things. And there's more investment opportunity there.
One thing about nuclear, a number of years ago, when I was working with Bruce Power, we looked at the idea of the hydrogen economy working with nuclear. There's a real natural synergy between the generation of power at night, where there's very little market. So you produce your hydrogen at night, distribute it in the day. So there's a natural, between two fuel sources, there's a natural synergy there. Now, what we could never work out was there's no distribution system. So in the end, we didn't do anything about it. For the hydrogen, well, there was no, because we'd have virtually had to finance the whole distribution system, then we'd have to get the province to probably convert all of our buses to hydrogen to make it work. But, I mean, if you want to look ahead at I don't so much disruptive as an opportunity for nuclear, if you could somehow tie it in with hydrogen generation, you could have and that could happen anywhere in the world. Now, we got another question that's shown up, so if I could go to the next question. Is the significant drop in solar demand in China going to affect the previous projections for high global adoption? Who knows about that? I'm not.
I can take a stab.
Yeah.
I can take a stab. So China is one of the few markets that moves. It's an oil tanker that can move fast when it wants to. It's very unusual because it's a single buyer, single decision maker authority, right? The issue in China is that when something happens, it happens fairly quickly and it happens wholesale. And so the move to solar was enormous for two reasons. One is China became extremely good at manufacturing solar panels, and also, so therefore, logical adoption within the country made sense. Part of the problem so you've got that fact, let's park that aside. The second fact is that China has the largest installed capacity of any country in the world. It's got about 1.5, the last figures I remember, 1.5 terawatts of installed capacity. The US and Europe, Western Europe combined, have about a terawatt each. And then the next, about 300 come Japan and India and others, and Canada is somewhere in that range, right? So you've got this massive amount, and you've got huge amounts of those were coal-fired, and then they decided they were going to shut some down because Beijing was getting polluted, other places were getting polluted. They signed on to COP21, all of those reasons. So you had a massive shutdown, and at the same time you had these very large increases in solar plants. Now, what you end up having is a swing, and the solar plants do cause disruption in the grid. The grid wasn't fully ready for it, and so you're ending up having a lot of curtailment. Both in India and China, you've had because of the initial enthusiasm and the incentives for people to go into solar, you ended up having a significant oversupply. And so you have curtailment, sometimes as much as 40%. I mean, in 2016, I think China curtailed between wind and solar as much as California consumes in 1 year, right? So you have these issues that it's dealing with. Now, coming back to the specific question, is it going to affect the previous projections for high global adoption of solar in particular? It may, but what we'll see slowly is other places taking on. Apart from thermal, where technical innovations took time, in solar, in wind, in storage, innovations are rapidly, the pace of innovation is increasing, and people in developing countries are waiting to take advantage of that, very much the way they did mobile. They bypassed the landline completely and went to mobile. So we don't know how this is going to progress. We are seeing improvements in solar panels from 17% to about 22%. That itself can enhance some of this. So will it affect? It probably will. Not for adoption, but maybe the percentage growth rates but I don't think it's going to affect energy demand. It's just energy demand will come from different sources. Offshore wind is now getting to be very competitive. In a lot of places, China, Taiwan, India are now looking at offshore wind too. So,
Other comments on
Yeah,
that?
just a comment. I mean, my specific experience with solar adoption has been around the economics of solar. So as the economics have gotten better, and it's able to provide our customers with cheaper and more reliable energy, they're asking for it. They're clamoring for it. I think people vote with their wallets, and I think we've seen the cost of solar continue to drop as the adoption continues to increase. It may have slowed down on a percentage basis, but my belief is that as the technology gets better and as costs continue to drop, the adoption rates will continue to rise.
You're optimistic.
I am.
All right. There is another couple of questions have shown up. By the way, it's interesting now, if there's anyone's got any live questions, please indicate it. We don't just have to rely on, I know it's revolutionary to ask people to say something in person, but we'll it's getting to the point now it's the exception rather than the rule. Okay, let's have a look at this. Do you see any one province leading innovation in the energy sector in Canada? Some better equipped to support disruption at this point in time? Question mark. So, is there one province that's more into innovation, you would say, than another?
I know Hydro-Quebec's doing a lot, and they're putting a lot of money into sort of, transforming their business model, and New Brunswick Power is repositioning as a result of, sort of forestry load not being what it was, and saying they have to reassess their model. And in Ontario, I think we're well positioned. We were out in front on AMI adoption, way ahead in 2005, ahead of most jurisdictions. We had a fit regime in place for solar adoptions. We now have to build intelligence into those renewable resources we have on the grid. We've gone off coal. We have a diversified grid in Ontario. And a lot of this is, I think, driven by government policy, and it's driven by the regulatory environment as well, and the cultures of the incumbent utilities. So, and like I said, the risk is always that rate-regulated revenue stream seems very attractive, but the problem is it's eroding.
It's like crack.
It's like, yeah.
Any other views on who's leading in Canada? Olivia, do you have a feel for that in terms of how you've observed things?
No, maybe just another call out for Quebec. Certainly they do have a large amount of hydro generation, and that they see a market to be exporting that. And so, obviously some arrangements with Ontario and maybe some with the U.S., but I do think they see that as a very big export market for themselves, and good on them for starting to think through how to deliver on that. So, but nothing more to add besides Brian.
Ron, did you?
Yeah, I just want to, I agree with everything that Brian said in terms of sort of what you're looking at. I think the interesting case is Ontario, where we've obviously had a change in government in the last 6 months. The previous government certainly would have said it led in policy and things like AMI, getting off of coal, the FIT program, et cetera. It there's a tendency to spend money to create opportunities and innovation. I think this government is quite clearly indicated there's going to be a lot less money available to do these things, but has said we will instead bring efforts to improve the regulatory environment, right? We actually have a guy in charge of reducing red tape, et cetera. So, and I think if you think about this adoption of innovation, that's a really big opportunity, right? If you believe, as I do, that the only way we're going to achieve this change at scale, it's when stuff doesn't require, subsidization. That's when you actually have things happen at scale. And so I think there's this opportunity to reimagine a regulatory environment that actually encourages the partnerships like we heard today, right? That encourages and sort of says, look, we're not going to tell you what to do, but we will certainly make sure we're not in the way because of rules or regulations. And I think that opportunity to imagine a place that levels the playing field, that creates more opportunities for new entrants, that's what I think will kind of create innovation. So I would challenge people to look at that, not the people that are just spending money on stuff, because that's not really scalable. What's scalable is the people in this room saying, I can see a real economic benefit to this.
I'm afraid the light is blinking red. So that's it. So no more questions. The panel time is over, but I want to thank all of you. I think I really enjoyed the panel. You gave us a tremendous overview of what's not only happening in this immediate area here, but around the world. So Ram, thank you very much. Olivia, thank you. Brian, thanks a lot. Andrew and Ron, thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please join with me in thanking our panel. Now, lunch will be available shortly. If not now, just back down into the grand ballroom. So thank you all for coming.